Have you ever wondered why in the most manicured, geometrically perfect royal parks of Europe and Russia, where every bush is trimmed to a ruler's edge, there suddenly appear piles of broken bricks and half-destroyed walls? Official history smilingly explains to us these are so-called caprices. Supposedly in the 18th and 19th centuries, the aristocracy had this strange fashion to build artificial ruins. Think for a second about the absurdity of this claim. We're told that monarchs who spent colossal sums to demonstrate their power, order, and wealth specifically hired thousands of workers to erect new, sturdy buildings, and then methodically demolished them, imitating decay. Do you really believe that in a world where every gold coin was accounted for and building materials cost a fortune, someone would spend millions to create garbage? They treat us like idiots. Right now, look at photos of the parks of Tsarskoye Selo, the Mon Repos estate, the English gardens of Stowe, or the French park of Ermenonville. What do you see? These are not papier-mâché decorations. These are solid structures of red brick and wild stone, with walls 3 feet thick, with arched vaults that cannot be built without the most complex engineering calculations. And we're supposed to believe that the architect first designed a perfect arch. The masons carved the blocks. The builders mixed tons of mortar, hoisted it all to height, and then other workers came with sledgehammers and started smashing the fresh masonry to create a romantic look? This is a lie that doesn't stand up to any scrutiny, neither by logic nor by economics. Historians claim that this was just an aesthetic trend inspired by paintings of ruinist artists. But let's dig deeper and look at it through the eyes of an engineer and economist, not a tour guide. Construction is always logistics. To erect even a small ruined tower, hundreds of thousands of bricks are needed. Where did they come from? In the 18th century, there were no factories with automated lines. Each brick is manual labor, mining clay, molding, drying, firing in kilns requiring enormous amounts of firewood. Forest in Europe at that time was a strategic resource, preserved for the navy. To cut down acres of forest to fire bricks for a building planned as a ruin from the start? This is not just wastefulness, it's a state crime. No sane king would allow such resource expenditure for a momentary whim. A completely different, frightening picture emerges. No one built these buildings specially ruined. They were already standing there. They had been standing there long before those we call the creators of the palace and park ensembles arrived on this territory. The new masters of life, the elite who came to power in the mid-18th to early 19th century, simply occupied the locations that survived after the catastrophe. What was well preserved, they restored, plastered, and called their own palaces. And what was too severely destroyed and beyond restoration, they simply fenced off, cleaned of dirt, and called romantic ruins, inventing a tale about a fashion for antiquity. Look at the quality of the masonry in these artificial ruins. It is identical to the quality of the masonry in the palaces themselves. The same mortar, the same brick, the same stone processing techniques, which, by the way, we today can barely replicate. If it were decoration, they would have built it from whatever was at hand, from rubble, from substandard material, since the building was supposed to look old anyway. But no, we see the highest quality of execution, designed to last centuries. Why such durability for a caprice? The answer is obvious. This is no caprice. These are remnants of functional technological structures from a past civilization, the purpose of which is being hidden from us. Recall the famous Ruin Tower in Catherine Park. Officially, it was built in honor of the victory over the Ottoman Empire. But if you come closer, you'll see that the ground level around the tower raises questions. The building seems sunk into the earth, just like most ancient buildings in our cities. The basement floor windows go into the soil. We're told that's how they built. Cultural layer. But forgive me, what cultural layer is there in an imperial park, where for centuries there was nothing but lawns and paths? Where did the yards of soil come from? If the tower was built as new decoration in 1771, why did architect Felton bury it? Why does the entrance look as if it was excavated? Here we come to the main contradiction that textbooks are silent about. These are the paintings of the so-called ruinists.
Hubert Robert, Giovanni Paolo Panini, Piranesi.
They are called fantasists who drew imaginary catastrophes. We're told that aristocrats looked at these paintings and said, "Oh, how beautiful, I want the same ruin in my garden." But what if it was exactly the opposite? The ruinist artists were not fantasists, but documentarians. They worked like cameras of their time. They captured reality, the world after a global catastrophe, cities buried in clay, destroyed giant structures among which tiny people in rags scurry about. These people in the paintings are not building. They don't know how to use it. They light fires amid majestic arches, dry laundry on the remnants of columns, and graze goats on the roofs of temples. The elite of that time, who appropriated these territories, faced a problem: how to explain the presence of these giant debris to the common people. You can't just say, "We captured this world which belonged to someone more advanced than us." They needed to fit these ruins into their own history. And then, a brilliant in its audacity, lie was invented. We built this, on purpose, for beauty. This explains why the fashion for ruins arose exactly when Europe began to recover from some global upheaval, traces of which we find everywhere. It's strange that this fashion was widespread and synchronous. From Portugal to the Urals, from Italy to Scotland, suddenly all kings simultaneously decided to build ruins. Synchronization of elite actions over such vast distances in the era of draft transport and sailing ships is impossible without a single command center. This was not a fashion. This was a unified directive for rewriting history, a cover-up operation. They called it landscape design, but in fact it was hiding evidence. Imagine you come to the ashes of someone else's house, paint the surviving wall, put a bench next to it, and tell guests, "I did this on purpose." It symbolizes the transience of existence. This is exactly what happened in the 18th century, but the most interesting thing lies not in the bricks, but in the numbers. If we analyze the economic reports of that time, construction estimates, and the amount of available labor force, we will see a gaping hole. The math simply doesn't add up. The number of serfs or hired workers officially involved in the constructions of the century physically could not perform the volume of earth and stoneworks attributed to them. Moving millions of cubic yards of soil to create artificial hills and ponds without excavators and bulldozers would require a population several times exceeding the official demographic data of that period. Who then performed this work? Or, more correctly, who performed it long before the Romanovs, Bourbons, and Windsors came to these lands? We have only just begun to unravel this tangle, and the facts ahead will be even harsher. We will talk about technologies that cannot be replicated even today, and about what is actually hidden under these artificial hills on which the artificial ruins stand. Let's set aside emotions and turn to dry, technical facts that demolish the official version of garden caprices to smithereens. If you get up close to the so-called ruins in the parks of Peterhof, Gatchina, or European residences, the first thing that will catch the eye of someone with a technical background is the mismatch in technologies. We're told this is 18th century brick and plaster, but try to find even one crack in the load-bearing structures of these decorations. Modern concrete starts crumbling after 50 years. Brick fired in primitive kilns delaminates from moisture and frost in a couple of decades. Yet these artificial ruins have stood under the open sky, under rain and snow, for supposedly 250 years, and time has no power over them. Pay attention to the joints between blocks. In some structures, for example in Monrepo Park or English landscape parks, polygonal masonry is used. Huge granite boulders are fitted to each other with such jeweler's precision that you can't slip a knife blade between them. And this is called primitive masonry, or imitation of wild nature? Seriously? To process granite like that, you need CNC machines and diamond cutters. Manually, with a chisel and hammer, it's physically impossible to make a curved joint between two multi-ton boulders so they fit perfectly. Any modern stonecutter will tell you that. It turns out that for building a playful ruin, kings used technologies superior to modern ones, and then supposedly forgot about them for 200 years.
Let's go further. Logistics. This is the most devastating argument against official history. Take, for example, the Pyramid in Catherine Park. Officially, it's a pavilion tomb for the Empress's favorite doggies. Sounds cute, until you start counting. The structure is made of brick and faced with granite slabs. The weight of such a construction is hundreds of tons. The soil in this area is swampy. For such a massive structure not to sink into the ground the first spring, it needs a foundation several yards deep, poured using technologies that only appeared in the 20th century. But we're told the foundation there is ordinary rubble. That's a lie. Either there is a giant platform hidden underground that we don't know about, or these structures are just the tip of the iceberg, the protruding part of something that goes deep down. And here we come to the most interesting thing: functionality. Why do decorative ruins have complex systems of chimneys and ventilation ducts inside the walls? Examine the ruins of the chapel pavilion or the arsenal. Perfectly straight, smooth channels are laid in the thickness of the walls. Historians say this is for heating so that the lords could drink tea warmly during a walk. Are you laughing? To heat a building without a roof, with broken-out windows and huge arches open to all winds? It's like trying to warm a street with an immersion heater. The efficiency of such a system is zero. No engineer would design stove heating for an open ruin gazebo. The conclusion suggests itself. These channels are not for smoke. Originally, these buildings were whole, airtight, and served a completely different function. Perhaps these channels were for laying communications, cables, or waveguides, the nature of which we can only guess. When the new masters came to the ruins, they saw holes in the walls and, with their primitive logic, decided they were chimneys. They tried to adapt them for stoves, but probably quickly realized the futility of the idea. Another shocking fact: acoustics. Many of these rotundas and arches have strange sound properties. If you stand in the center of certain ruins and whisper a word, it will be heard hundreds of yards away, moreover with amplification. This is no accident. This is precise mathematical calculation of the vault curvature. To build a complex acoustic resonator, just to then destroy its roof and call it a caprice? That's absurd. These were technical stations, possibly communication, navigation, or atmospheric electricity stations. The shape of many pavilions, rotundas, pyramids, stelae, perfectly suits work with vibrations and frequencies. And finally, the question of orientation. Almost all these objects, scattered across Europe's parks, are strictly oriented to the cardinal directions, or specific stars. Pyramids, obelisks, towers.
They form a single geodetic network. If you plot them on a map, you'll see clear geometric figures, lines connecting objects in different countries. Did 18th century architects, without satellites and accurate maps, agree among themselves, "You build a ruin in Potsdam, and I'll build one in Tsarskoye Selo, and they'll lie on one line with precision to the degree"? Of course not. This is the remnants of a global infrastructure, a unified energy system or transport network of the past. When the catastrophe occurred, this network was destroyed. Some objects survived better, some worse. Those that survived became palaces and cathedrals. Those that suffered more were declared artificial ruins. The authorities simply legalized what they could not demolish or restore. They turned the evidence of the collapse of a highly advanced civilization into an attraction for the nobility. But the scariest thing is not even this. The scariest thing is the demographic data of that time, which completely refutes the possibility of such mass construction. Where did the millions of workers' hands come from to create these masterpieces, right after devastating wars and epidemics which, according to the same textbooks, mowed down a third of the population? The numbers they show us do not match the volume of work done. Now we have approached the scariest secret, which makes historians nervously rewrite textbooks and adjust dates. Let's talk about people. More precisely, about their catastrophic absence. If you open the official demographic summaries of the 18th and early 19th centuries, you will see a strange picture. Constant epidemics of plague, cholera, smallpox, endless wars taking hundreds of thousands of lives. Europe and Russia are literally bleeding out. The population is shrinking or stagnating, and at the same time, against the backdrop of total extinction and famine, we're told there was an unprecedented construction boom. Think about this insane inconsistency. We're told that while people were dying from diseases and malnutrition, kings drove millions of peasants to chisel granite for artificial ruins and dig ponds with shovels. This is a lie. In survival conditions, no society spends resources on decorations. If your house is on fire, you don't wallpaper. If the people are dying out, they don't build park pavilions in the form of ancient temples. This construction boom attributed to them could not physically be provided by the labor force of that time. There simply weren't enough people. Look at the engravings of that period, not the parade portraits painted later on order, but documentary sketches of cities. Rome, Paris, London, Petersburg. What do you see? Deserted streets. Vast squares with not a soul, or 2-3 people in rags shuffling along. Ghost cities. Majestic buildings stand with broken-out windows, trees grow on roofs, and cows graze at the foot of palaces. This doesn't look like the flourishing of empire. This looks like post-apocalypse. This is the world after the Great Reset. This is where the riddle of the artificial ruins lies. These park structures are not the whim of architects. They are the tips of the iceberg. They are what remains of a pre-flood civilization that was washed away or destroyed by a weapon unknown to us. Notice the strange feature of most of these ruins. They are almost always half buried in earth or clay. We're convinced this is a design choice. Grotto. But why do grottos have brickwork extending deep down? Why do they find bricked-up windows and doors inside these hills? We are faced with the fact of a global catastrophe, commonly called the clay flood or mud flood. Enormous masses of soil engulfed cities, burying the first floors of buildings. Those who survived, or those who came later, simply settled into the upper floors, turning former second floors into first ones, and what protruded from the ground in parks and forests, domes, arches, tower tops, they called pavilions and ruins. It was easier for them to invent a fairy tale about a caprice than to excavate these gigantic complexes. Look at the sizes. This is another shocking fact. Doorways in these ruins, step heights, ceiling heights, they are not designed for people of our stature. Arches 16 feet high for passage? Steps inconvenient for a person of average height to climb? This is architecture of giants, those whom mythology called Atlanteans or Titans. We modern people look like children who have put on their father's jacket in these decorations.
We are a parasite civilization that settled into someone else's empty house. We use the remnants of their greatness, but don't even understand the purpose of these objects. Imagine a savage who found a smartphone and uses it as a mirror or a board for cutting meat. We do the same. We stroll through parks, look at the ruin tower, and think it's a gazebo. But it could have been a Tesla tower, an atmospheric electricity generator, or part of a portal system. Hence the strange, impossible for that time stone processing, polygonal masonry, and absence of binding mortar in the megalithic blocks. We didn't build this. We just painted it and hung a plaque, Architectural Monument. Official history is a screen designed to hide the fact of our defeat or our artificial origin. Perhaps we are descendants of those who survived the catastrophe, went feral, and lost the technologies. Or even scarier, we are a new batch of bio-robots, brought to a cleared territory to service the surviving infrastructure for unseen masters. And these artificial ruins were left specially, not for beauty, but as a reminder or as markers. Think about why these objects are so carefully guarded. Why, in many parks, is access to the undergrounds under the ruins blocked by grates, and any attempts at independent research are suppressed? If these are just 18th century bricks, what is there to fear? But if under these hills are hidden entrances to a single underground network of tunnels connecting continents, or preserved technologies of the past, then the silence of the scientists becomes understandable. We live on the cemetery of a great civilization, and every time a tour guide tells you the king built this ruin to mourn the eternal, he, possibly without knowing it, utters part of the terrible truth. It is indeed a monument of grief. Grief for the perished world that was thousands of times more advanced than ours. But the most interesting thing begins when we ask the question, and what exactly destroyed this world? Traces of melted stone on the ruins, vitrification of bricks, strange craters that we take for lakes, all this indicates that the war was not with bows and arrows. Now, when your faith in the official version of garden caprices has been shaken, it's time to look at the walls of these ruins point blank. If you take a powerful magnifying glass or macro lens and examine the surface of the so-called aged bricks in the parks of Tsarskoye Selo, in the estates of England or Italy, you will discover something that sends shivers down your spine. These are not traces of a chisel with which workers supposedly chipped off pieces to create an effect of antiquity. These are traces of monstrous thermal impact. Many bricks and stones are covered with a thin film of glazing. In science, this is called vitrification. To turn clay or granite into a glassy mass, a temperature over 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit is needed. An ordinary wood fire, even the strongest, gives a maximum of 1,500 or 1,700 degrees. At such a temperature, stone smokes and cracks, but does not flow like melted wax.
And on many artificial ruins, we see exactly stone drips, drops of granite frozen in flight. This is evidence of the use of weapons of colossal power. We're told the king wanted to build a ruin, but the facts scream the opposite. The king fenced off the site where a pinpoint strike of unknown nature occurred. That's why the so-called ruins often stand isolated. These are epicenters, places where some force burned everything to the ground, leaving only the skeletons of buildings. The elite who occupied these lands simply could not demolish these melted megaliths. They didn't have the equipment capable of crushing the vitrified monolith.
So they invented a fairy tale about the aesthetics of destruction. This is a classic principle. If you can't hide the evidence, make it a landmark. Recall the so-called Year Without a Summer, 1816. Official science mumbles something about the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. But the climate anomalies, when snow fell in summer and crops rotted across the northern hemisphere, remarkably coincide with the period of active construction, read clearance, of these very ruins and the replanning of cities. What if the volcanic winter was actually a nuclear or dust winter after a global conflict? The sky was shrouded in ash from burned cities, those very ones whose ruins we photograph in parks today. It is exactly at this time that a strange unification of architecture occurs worldwide. The so-called antique style, or empire style, suddenly appears everywhere, from Washington to St. Petersburg, from Australia to South Africa. We're told fashion. But it looks like the restoration of civilization, according to unified blueprints found in surviving bunkers, or like the activity of a single managing corporation that came to a cleared territory and began building its administrative centers, capitals, Reichstags, senates, on the foundations of destroyed ancient infrastructure. And now look at the chemical composition of the soil around the ruins. Independent researchers who took soil samples in old parks find anomalous levels of heavy metals and isotopes that could not appear there naturally. The ground there is literally saturated with the periodic table. That's why these zones were turned into parks. It was impossible to live there, impossible to grow bread. Radiation or chemical contamination had to weather out. And to prevent people from settling there, these zones were declared royal residences. Guards and fences were put up. Gardens and parks are exclusion zones of the past. Beautiful green sarcophagi over catastrophe sites. We stroll through graveyards. We admire the ruin tower, not realizing that before us is the skeleton of a destroyed power station, whose explosion possibly wiped out the population of an entire region. Notice how selectively the buildings were destroyed. Often only the upper part or one wall is demolished, and demolished in such a way as if the shockwave came from a certain direction. If masons were building this, they would make the masonry evenly. But here we see the dynamics of an explosion frozen in stone. And the most cynical thing in this story is the substitution of concepts. We've been brainwashed that ruins are romantic. We've been trained to look at destroyed houses, at the annihilated achievements of high culture, and feel not horror and anger, but tenderness and melancholy. This is a brilliant psychological operation, memory programming. If you see a bombed house and think, how beautiful, you will never start looking for those who dropped the bomb. You will never ask, who killed the people who lived here? You accept it as a given, as the course of time. Time destroys everything, they tell us. But look at the Egyptian pyramids or polygonal masonry in Peru. They stand for thousands of years, and time takes no toll on them. It's not time and not wind that destroys. Targeted strikes destroy.
And those artificial ruins in our parks are monuments to the war that we lost even before we were born. The war in which humanity was thrown back to the Stone Age, lost its memory, and became an obedient herd grazing on the ruins of the civilization of gods. But why was this necessary? Who was hindered by that past civilization? And why do current authorities so diligently guard this lie, prohibiting excavations and declaring any inconvenient finds falsifications?
The answer is simple and terrifying. Because the technologies that the builders of these ruins possessed gave people freedom. Free energy, instant teleportation, longevity. The current system is built on scarcity, on resource control, on selling oil and gas. If we realize that these ruins are parts of atmospheric generators of etheric energy, the entire economy of modern elites will collapse in one day. We have come to the finale of our investigation, and now the scattered fragments of the mosaic come together into a single, frightening and grandiose picture. These artificial ruins are not just stones scattered in parks. They are seals of silence on the lips of true history. All the facts we've dissected, from the impossible manual labor logistics and polygonal masonry to traces of high-temperature melting and gaping demographic gaps, lead us to one inevitable and terrifying conclusion. Our civilization does not develop linearly and progressively from a stone axe to a smartphone, as they lie to us in schools. We live in a closed cycle. We are just another shift in this giant anthill, and judging by everything, far from the most successful, and not the freest. The concept of the Great Reset, about which today they speak so loudly and openly from high international tribunes, is not at all the invention of modern politicians or economists. This is a time-tested, ruthless mechanism for managing reality. Those unseen puppeteers who write the script of our history act according to the same pattern. Global territory clearance, a period of managed chaos and savagery, then the introduction of new elites who appropriate the surviving remnants of technologies, and finally, the total rewriting of generations' memory. The artificial ruins are scars from the previous reset, which probably happened quite recently, in the 19th century. They deliberately left these giant debris in plain sight for us, but distorted their meaning. This was done so that we would get used to the sight of destruction, so that at a subconscious level we believe that greatness is possible only in the distant mythical past, and our business is small and insignificant. Why hide the truth with such fanaticism? The answer lies in the plane of resources and power. Imagine for a second that tomorrow you learn that electricity, heat, and light can be obtained directly from the air, for free and in unlimited quantities, using resonant technologies that the builders of those very ruins possessed. What will happen in that same instant to oil corporations, coal mines, banks, and states collecting taxes on resources? They will disappear like smoke. All the boundless power of the world rests solely on our engineered dependence on paid resources and our total ignorance. But in this story, there is an even more alarming, chilling thought. Why is this information breaking through to the surface like an avalanche right now? Why have we suddenly, as if waking from deep hypnosis, started noticing what was right under our noses for 200 years? Perhaps the shelf life of the current version of civilization is expiring. Look carefully around. Endless climate hysterics, strange new diseases, open talks about digital control and the need to reduce population. Doesn't it seem to you that the scenery on the stage is changing again? Perhaps they are preparing the ground for a new catastrophe to create new, romantic ruins, this time from our glass and concrete skyscrapers, from our stadiums and shopping centers.